Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Good morning. Man, it's so nice today. It feels like it's been a while. It's just been cloudy and rainy and windy. My wife has been getting after me. So we have a trampoline. It's the second trampoline we've had because our first one ended up in our neighbor's yard last year from the winds. And so anyway, we have some tie downs that we're supposed to be putting on the legs to keep it in place, and it's moved. The width or the circumference of the trampoline has moved at least that much more already. So she's getting nervous. But anyway, so I need to go out there and do that. But it's been really nice, and today and fortunately our trampoline is still in our yard, and we'll get out there hopefully tomorrow and nail that thing down. So we've been speaking recently for the last month and a half or so, I suppose, about emotional health, and it's kind of nested in this greater idea of a godly community and godly people, and we've been talking about the idea that to be spiritually healthy and to be spiritually strong, we need to be emotionally healthy and emotionally mature, and that we can't actually be spiritually mature if we're emotionally unhealthy or immature. And so we're calling this little series within a series, we're calling it Emotionally Healthy, Spiritually Strong. And so far, we have explored the effect that our past has on us today, the power of recognizing our brokenness and of being vulnerable, and we actually also spoke about the power of breaking, or the ability to break the power of our past through Yeshua and through His work and what He's done for us. And the last 2 weeks we spoke about recognizing God's gift of limits within our lives. Right, the first week we looked at His gift that He gave us within His Word. And then last week, Judy spoke to us about natural limits that He's given to us and He's built into us that we should respect and work within. And as we've been going, I think some of these things that we've been talking about can be uncomfortable. Right? They can be sometimes it's maybe a conversation that we don't really want to have, and it's interesting because most of these conversations are conversations we need to have with ourselves. Right? We need to, look at the mirror, so to speak, and say, "Self, why am I like this? And why am I doing?" And doing that can be uncomfortable because we can pull up things that we've hidden for a long time, and we're probably going to talk a little bit more about that today and next week. But it can be uncomfortable to face things that we've put off for so long, that we've stuffed down, that we've thrown in the closet and slammed the door. And so some of these conversations are uncomfortable. But we need to have them. Right? We need to be able to talk to ourselves and talk to the Lord and say, "Okay, self, what is wrong with me? Why am I acting like this? Why do I feel this way? God, help me. Shine a light within me." And then when we find the thing that's causing the ruckus, then we can bring it to Him and say, "God, help me with this. Help me to move past this. Help me to grow in this area." And so, but even though they're difficult to talk about, these are things that we need to talk about when we need to integrate into our lives if we're going to be emotionally healthy and spiritually strong. So this morning we're going to talk about something else that's a topic that isn't spoken about very much and is probably has the potential of being uncomfortable, and that is the topic of grief and loss. Ecclesiastes 3 says, "For everything there's a season and a time for every matter under heaven." It goes through several different things. In verse 4 it says, "A time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance." And just a few chapters later, Solomon is still writing, and in chapter 7 of Ecclesiastes, he says, "It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of fasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting." Excuse me, did I say fasting? House of mourning instead of feasting, not fasting. It's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. This is very interesting to me, that the wisest man, ostensibly, to have ever lived, is saying that it's better to be mourning than to be laughing. That sorrow, it says, sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. Why is the heart made glad? We'll probably talk about that in just a second. But it's interesting to me that he's talking about this because this is painful. Right? When we go to the house of mourning, there's a reason that we're there. It's not as he alludes to, it's not to have a good time. We're not there to see how many friends we can make or how good we can feel, but we're there because we're going through something difficult. Right? We're there because of pain. We're there because of something has happened. We've experienced a loss that's grievous, and so we're here and we're mourning. And it's interesting too. I think that one of the reasons is that this is another thing that he alludes to, is that this is a prescient reminder of our limitations. Right? It reminds us of our own humanity and that there's a limitation to us, and he says this is the end of all mankind. Right? It helps us to stop and consider, to think about things, and oh man, someday this is going to be me. Right? Yes, we're there because we're mourning usually, this house of mourning is talking because somebody has passed away, right? And so this person has gone, and he says, this is what's going to happen to me someday, right? It may be today, it may be next month, it may be 20 years or 50 years from now, but this is going to happen to me at some point. What am I doing with my life, right? Well, then it causes us to think about things. Man, I just had an argument with my spouse or with my sibling or whatever it might be. Was it really that important? Right? Am I these things that I'm hanging on to, should I be clinging to them, or should I right? We reevaluate our priorities. We reevaluate the things that we hold dear. And I think in the end, we're better for it, right? It says, through sadness of face, the heart is made glad, right? Because we're contemplating, we're going through this. And I think it's interesting, though, because when we find ourselves in the house of mourning, as Solomon puts it, it doesn't feel like the better option, right? Like when I think back in my life about the times that I've been in the house of mourning, if I think too hard on it, start to get emotional, because I think of who was it that I lost, and what came to an end, and it wasn't pretty, right? It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't something that I would have chosen for myself. And yet he says that there's something there for us if we'll take hold of it. In the messianic prophecy of Isaiah 62, one of the things that the Messiah would do is to bind up the brokenhearted, to comfort all who mourn, to grant those who mourn in Zion, to give them a beautiful headdress instead of ashes, and the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of a faint spirit, or a garment of praise instead of a spirit of heaviness, that they may be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. And this is interesting to me, because it seems like, even though Solomon is saying that it's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of mirth, that at the same time there's going to come a point where all of this mourning will be done away with. Right? This was actually a present, a promise, a guarantee that God has given to his people, that one day that all of this sorrow, all this difficulty will be done away with. But until that day comes, I guess maybe one way to look at it is that we're stuck with grief, right? We're stuck with mourning. We're stuck with loss. And we have to learn to deal with these things in a healthy way. And we have to learn to live with loss and live with grief in the most healthy way we can. So this morning I want to talk about, I'm going to start this morning. I actually couldn't fit it all in today. I don't think you guys wanted to be here for like a couple hours, so we're going to split it up between today and next week, and between the 2 weeks, we're going to talk about processing grief and loss in our lives. And today I'm going to talk about what good is grief, right? Solomon says that it's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of mirth. And what good is it, really? How does grief help us in our life? Before I start down this path, there's something I want to say. And most of what I'm going to say this week and next week has to do with us, with me. When we look in the mirror, right? When we're thinking in our head, like that's the person that we're going to be talking about and dealing with for the most part. And before I do that, I want to briefly touch on how we can relate to others who are grieving, how we can help them the most, I guess. And this is just going to be a quick couple minutes, but this week as I was thinking about this and kind of studying, I came across a woman who she and her husband are pastors of a church, well known, all this stuff. And her son unexpectedly passed away, and she was talking about what was it? It was traumatic grief, right? The idea that something traumatic happened that was outside the norm. Maybe somebody was murdered, or there was suicide, or something where it wasn't. Maybe multiple family members were lost at once, and she was talking about how with their own grief, people would try to comfort them, would talk to them and say things that they thought were going to be helpful, or maybe they didn't know what else to say, but they were working at it, they were trying, and their heart was good, but the things that they said actually caused more pain and hurt. And so I'm going to spend a couple minutes of talking about first of all, what not to say to somebody who's grieving, which I don't usually focus on the negative side of something, but I want to just mention a couple things, and then I'm going to talk a couple of things about this is how to interact with somebody who's grieving. So, first thing not to say when somebody is grieving is at least. Right? At least you had your son or your daughter for X years, for 12 years, for 20 years, for whatever it is. At least you had that time with them. At least you know that they're in heaven. At least you can get married again, maybe to a widow or a widower. Or even, at least you can have more children. At least you got to know where his body was. At least you had the job for this long. Right? When we say at least, what does it do? Right? It minimizes. It says, you know what, your grief and your trauma isn't really that bad. Because at least this other thing, just count your blessings. Right? We're communicating to someone that what you experience isn't that big of a deal, and you shouldn't feel quite as bad as you are, because at least fill in the blank. Sometimes in our attempt to comfort somebody, in our attempt to help them, we say something like this, and it causes more pain and more grief instead of alleviating it. And it's instead of what we tried to do when we were trying to comfort, we end up causing more harm and more pain. We don't want to minimize the loss that our friend is or a family member has experienced. And we want to communicate to them that it's okay for them to feel their grief and to express it. Something else not to say. God must have wanted him or her in heaven more than he wanted them on earth. Maybe it was God's will for this to happen. Right? I don't think that when we look in Scripture, it's ever God's will to kill somebody, to end a life, to cause trauma. This is not God's will. And so statements like these, the at least, maybe it was God's will. God must have wanted them more, with him than with us. Just put more pain on the grieving person. And sometimes we run the risk of mischaracterizing our Heavenly Father, right? Instead of painting him as the kind, patient, faithful, caring Father he is, then we might end up painting him as somebody who's vindictive and trying to teach us a lesson through inflicting great harm and pain to us that otherwise we could have gone without. And we don't want to make God cruel, and we don't want to minimize somebody's grief and loss. And so when we tell a loved one who's experiencing grief or loss these things, in some way we're communicating to them that they need to contain themselves better, and really is to make us feel more comfortable, right? So we need to figure out how can we relate to somebody who's going through a lot of grief and experiencing a big loss. What should we do? What should we say instead? I think the first thing is just that we can just show up. Right? We see that in the book of Job, his friends did really well for about 7 days. Right? They came up and they just sat with him. It says they just sat there for 7 days because they saw that his loss was great. Right? And those 7 days, they did great. They were perfect. That was exactly what Job needed. And I think that the difficult part about that is that silence is uncomfortable. That we feel restless, and especially when there's something, in the air, so to speak. Like we know that there's this loss. We know that this thing has happened. We know that there's been trauma. We know that you're grieving. How do I handle this? I just want to say something. And so I'm trying to comfort you. So I try to, well, it's not as bad, right? Like at least this, right? We start to say some things that we might not need to. So the first thing is we just want to show up and just be there. We don't need to say much of anything. The second thing that we can do is give them a hug. Just give them a hug. Even people who aren't touchy-feely need hugs. Especially when we're going through a difficult time, especially when we're grieving, that human touch, that human connection is something that's you can't put a price on. One of the base needs that we have as human beings is the need for positive, loving touch. Like we were talking about this morning in the Torah study, that the Metzora, the person that we've termed as leper in English, needs, like at the end of that, like finally they've been healed and they've been cleansed, and now they can experience touch again for the first time. The touch is healing, and it brings health and restoration to touch somebody. So we can offer them a hug, and then if we want and need to say something, what we say is, "I'm sorry for your loss. I'm so sorry for your loss." And I think those few words just say that I'm with you. This isn't something that you have to go through alone, and I'm not minimizing it. You can express your loss, you can express your grief, you can feel it deeply, and it's okay, and I'm so sorry this is happening to you. I'm praying for you. I'm praying for you and your family. We're keeping you in prayer. I just want you to know Right? These are things that we can say and say, I'm sorry for your loss, and that we're praying for you, to say that we are coming alongside of you in your grief, that it's okay to express yourself, and this is how, as a community, we want to handle grief and loss with those with us. So, something that I want to say is that when we go through something that's traumatic, is that grieving is a choice. That we have to choose to grieve. Mourning just happens to us, right? We hear the terrible news that somebody that was dear to us is gone or has passed away, or something traumatic has happened. We've experienced a great loss, and sometimes the response our initial response is denial. No, that can't happen. No, I can't accept that, right? And we want to push it away and say, no, I don't believe that's true, and that can't come to me. But whether we start with denial or we start with acceptance, when it hits us, we know because we're mourning, right? That truth hits us, and now we've already we just can't help but mourn. And so mourning is automatic. Mourning is something that happens, and we can't help it, right? A lot of times it hits us like a ton of bricks. But grieving, I think grieving is something a little bit different than mourning. We have to choose to grieve. We have to choose to work through this loss, work through this grief that's hitting us. And in order for us to grieve well, we have to have a proper perspective of grief, because if we don't have a proper perspective, we aren't going to spend the time that we need doing what's necessary, processing this difficult issue in our life. So the first thing that I think that sometimes when we're confronted with the opportunity to grieve, is that we say, I can't do this right now. I can't grieve. Why? This is an interruption. I can't afford an interruption in my life. I just can't do this right now. And so we put it aside. We put it in a compartment. We stuff it down. We throw it in a closet in our heart and our mind. And we say, I can't do this right now. But we have to recognize that grieving is not an interruption. Grieving is not an interruption. In Numbers chapter 20, verses 23 through 29, we have this story of when Aaron passed away. Right? One of these great instrumental leaders of the children of Israel, and he passed away. And it said that when all the congregation saw that Aaron had died, all the house of Israel wept for Aaron for 30 days. Right? It wasn't this, okay, just take a couple of days, guys. We'll, get yourself together and then we'll move on and we'll be okay. No. They stopped and they said, no, we are grieving. This word for wept is to weep, to bewail. It's bakah. Right? They experienced this Aaron's death. They experienced this grief, and they let it come in deep, and they experienced that, and they embraced the loss. They embraced this time where God says, we're just going to pause. We're going to put everything else on hold, and we're going to recognize that this is what's necessary now. We're going to embrace this time. They deeply experienced Aaron's death. They mourned and they chose to grieve him fully. And grieving Aaron's death wasn't an inconvenience that they tolerated. It was a life event that they needed to wade through together. Right? It's the same for us as it was for them. Grieving is not an interruption. grief will help us grow and mature if we let it. You know, going back to Ecclesiastes, it says, sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. Why? Why is the heart made glad? Because wisdom and healthy perspective is gained. And during this process, when Israel was grieving the loss of Aaron, the words that are used wasn't just this superficial, when Yeshua comes to the house where this 12-year-old daughter was dead, and there's the weepers were in there, right? The grievers were there, and they were weeping. And what happened? He says, oh, she's just asleep, and they laughed. Maybe they were laughing because, sometimes when something is so bizarre to us and we don't know how else to take it, we laugh. But I'm wondering if maybe, before I say this, during this time you could hire grievers, right? And then people would come and okay, it's my turn to come and mourn for this person, and so they would do this. But it wasn't necessarily the same grief that maybe her parents would feel, right? And so I'm wondering if during this story, if they were able to switch on a dime, because it wasn't quite that, it was more of a superficial grieving, but this word that it says for the Israelites is that they felt Aaron's death, they felt this loss deep, that the idea is that they fully embraced it and they let it come down, and I think that it's during difficult times, we see the trees, and we know that during winter all the leaves fall off, and it looks like nothing's happening, but we know that that's during that difficult season that the roots go down, and they go farther, and the tree goes down so that you can withstand the storms and the things that come later. And it's during difficult times like grief, where when we fully experience it, when we fully embrace it, when we walk through it, that there comes a depth to our soul that isn't there otherwise. There comes a maturing in us that we can't get any other way. There comes an ability. Through my grief, I can not just commiserate with somebody who's grieving, but I can empathize with you. Because now I've gone through great loss. I've gone through great grief. And so now I can, as Shaul says, that we can comfort those who need comfort because we've gone through the same thing. Sometimes we have a tendency not to grieve losses in our life because, like other uncomfortable emotions, we see it as a nuisance or something to get through or get over as quickly as possible so we can move on with our lives. As I said a minute ago, that mourning can be automatic, but grieving has to be done intentionally. And I think that we have a tendency we're more prone to grieve big losses in our lives than we are the little ones. We're more prone to, if I lose a family member, I'm more prone to grieve that loss than if I lost a job, for example. Right? That obviously these big ones where we lose somebody who's close to us, like it's expected that we're going to grieve that, and we'll hopefully process and we'll take time. But I think that sometimes we overlook smaller griefs. We overlook smaller losses in our life as not that big a deal. I just need to get past this. I'm just going to keep going on. And I think the danger is that, as one author put it this week, that when I was reading, was that those accumulate like stones in our soul and weigh us down, and we don't recognize, because it happens over time, we don't recognize how weighed down we are by these little griefs that we have accumulated. We haven't properly processed. How often do we grieve the smaller or perceived insignificant losses in our lives. You know, some losses are natural parts of our life. Transitions from one phase of life to the next. You know, when Judy and I would visit family when we lived in Washington, we'd visit here, we'd visit in Colorado, and we didn't have a problem coming to our family's house. It was fun. It was, you know, we looked forward to it, but it took us a long time to leave. And I mean, like, I don't mean when we were kids when we left their house. I mean when we were visiting, it would literally be, oh yeah, we're going to get up, we're going to be gone by 8 o'clock. It's like 1:30, 2 o'clock, and we're still around, right? Because we don't want to leave, because leaving is sad. Right? Coming was fun and all that, but leaving was sad, and I think there's those two halves of most transitions in our life where yes, we're moving into something, but then we're losing something else for that. You know, maybe we leave high school or college, we graduate, and now we've got to face this big scary world, and we've lost our some of our emotional or financial security. Right? We're excited maybe to go out and to make our way and to do all these things, but also there can be sometimes this fear or trepidation, and look what I'm leaving behind. Look at all those memories that I've left. Right? What am I going to do with all now? I just want to stay around campus and remember all the fun that we had, and remember when we did this over here and that over there, and right. But then we recognize, well, our friends aren't staying. Friends are leaving, so it's not going to be right. There's loss associated with that transition. For some of us, as we grow, we might and we age, we might look back at earlier times in our life and be like, oh man, I wish I would have when I was younger, because now I can't. Maybe we just have more wrinkles than we're comfortable with or whatever. But man, to be young again. Maybe we move, right? This is actually for quite a few of us here. Most of us actually have moved within the last few years, and we've moved from relationships and friendships, and what happens to those, right? Like sometimes we lose friendships because of a transition, and we have to take the time to recognize that and to grieve that loss, right? Not just chalk it up as, yeah, you know, people move on and that's life. Let's just, right? But no, we had a really good friendship, and now they won't return my call. I've lost something here. And we have to take time to grieve this loss so it doesn't weigh us down. Maybe relationships don't work out the way that we wanted. Maybe for those of us, our kids are growing up, or maybe our kids are out of the house, that our kids are becoming less and less dependent on us, right? I loved it when they would come up and ask me to do this or that, and I can't remember the last time that any of that happened. Right? There's this, from what I hear, there's this kind of a juxtaposition of emotions with empty nesting, where yes, we've got freedom, and my kids are gone, right? Like there's these two sides of that coin, and we have to, we need to take the time that's necessary. We need to, first of all, recognize that this loss has happened. And we're going to talk about this more next week. We need to recognize that a loss has happened, and then we need to recognize that it's not an inconvenience that we need to just process. Right? We need to recognize that we need to accept the loss within us instead of trying to keep it at arm's length. We need to accept it within us, and we need to recognize that it's going to help us to grow and mature and to have a depth to us. The people that I like to engage with, I don't know about you, but the people I like to engage with, the most and talk to the most are people who have depth. Right? Where you talk to them, and not everything is just about the weather and maybe the Bears or whatever, like what just all this upper layer stuff. But they're happy to dive in and go deep with you. We had some friends who came from Washington for our daughter's bat mitzvah, and these are some of the people with the most depth that I know. And one moment we could be talking about the weather, and the next moment we could be talking about how painful something was in their life, in our life, whatever. And the next moment, oh man, I was so excited, just felt so good about this thing. Like there's this range where they're able to operate in, because they've embraced grief, they've embraced loss, and they've said, okay, I'm accepting this, and I'm going to own this, and we're going to work through it. And those are the kinds of people that I like to interact with the most. That's the kind of person that I want to be. And in order for me to get there, I'm going to have to accept loss. I'm going to have to process my grief. I'm going to have to recognize that these things have happened and take them on as my own, because they are. Right? Whether it's just like, Shabbat is holy and set apart, whether or not we recognize that. Grief and loss, these things that happen to us, are ours, whether we recognize it or not. But by recognizing and accepting it and working through it, then our soul can get depth. Right? Then we can receive healing. Then we can have roots that go down deeper. It's also interesting that more than half of the book of Psalms is composed of lament. Right? That even the psalmists, from David to Asaph to the sons of Korah, like all these guys, I mean, think about David, King David. Mighty man, right? Conqueror, king. The fame of him went out so much that people were afraid to attack Israel. And yet, he's lamenting. And yet he recognizes grief. And yet he experiences loss, and he cries. Oh. He wouldn't make it today, would he? Right? In our society, oh, you weakling, you need to cry. Real men do not cry. But he does. He experiences grief, and he embraces it. I'm trying to find. I've got. It says, "O Lord," this is Psalm 38. "O Lord, my longing is before you. My sighing is not hidden from you. My heart throbs. My strength fails me, and the light of my eyes, it also is gone from me. My friends and companions stand aloof from my plague, and my nearest of kin stand far off." God, I'm alone. I can't take this. "Those who seek my life lay their snares. Those who seek my hurt speak of ruin and meditate treachery all day long." "But I am like a deaf man. I do not hear, like a mute man who does not open his mouth. I have become like a man who does not hear, and in whose mouth are no rebukes. But for you, O Lord, do I wait. But for you, O Lord, do I wait. It is you, O Lord my God, who will answer." Right? David experienced grief throughout his life, and at every turn he didn't say, "You know what, it's okay. We don't worry. We're just going to ignore that. We're just going to move on." But he took the time. When we'll talk about this more next week probably. When King Saul passed, he said, "No, all of Israel, we need to wait. We need to mourn. We need to not rush this moment. And we're going to write this lament and teach it to the generations to come." And so he would experience this, and he would bring the grief in, and then he would experience it, and then he would turn around and cry out to God and say, "God, I know that you are here. I know that you will help me. I know that you are my refuge. You are my strength, an ever-present help in time of trouble." Right? This is how we should react. This is how we should embrace grief in our own lives. And I think that we need to do it not just for the big things, not just for the catastrophic losses, but for the little ones too. Maybe, I don't know, depending on what part of life we are, depending on how important things are to us, various things can take on great significance in our life. Maybe we're broke and our car breaks down and we've been working really hard and now, God, what am I going to do? And we're distraught. We need to be okay with just waiting and saying, instead of just moving on with, okay, I just need to solve this problem and which does need to be solved, right? We need a car. I need to be able to get to work. I need to not lose my job. But we need to find time and say, okay, I'm going to grieve this loss. This was a big deal to me. Job's loss wasn't just his kids, right? Now I'm minimizing. Forgive me. Job's loss wasn't limited to his family and his children. Before that, he lost all his other material things, right? And I think that sometimes we try to spiritualize away some things and say, oh, it's just things. It's just money. It's just, right? That's kind of the equivalent of saying, well, at least it's just, right? We're telling ourselves, and I think sometimes we try to cope in this way of I don't know how I'm going to make it. If I don't tell myself this, I'm going to break down and I don't know if I'm going to be able to come back. Right? Maybe, okay, I'm going to talk about catastrophic loss for just a second, then we'll come back to the non-catastrophic. Sometimes when we have catastrophic loss, we don't want to deal with it because when we go there, we recognize that I'm mourning this catastrophic loss that has happened to me. But in doing that, let's say there's an analogy of, okay, I'm going to go into this room, and this room is the room of grief, of catastrophic loss. But when I get in here, I recognize that there's all these other little doors that I have of grief that I haven't dealt with yet. That when I'm in here and I open this other little door, these other little doors are bursting with something. I open that, and that's the grief that I haven't dealt with from when my parents divorced. I can't handle that right now. And I'm still in this room, and I'm grieving my catastrophic loss, but okay, now this was an issue with my marriage early on that we never dealt with, and I can't go back, and I can't think about that right now. And as we are in this area of grief, we recognize that there's all these other things that we've never dealt with. And so it's difficult for us to stay in this room of dealing with this catastrophic grief and this loss because it's opened up the memory of all these other things that have happened, so we leave. We say, I can't do that right now. And if we start to allow ourselves to grieve, we're afraid that because of all these other things that we've stuffed down, that we've closed into the closet, that we've kept away from us, that we're never going to be able to come out of that room if we allow ourselves to grieve fully. If that's you, I want you to know that you will come out. That we have to process that grief, that we have to work through that in order to become whole. That grief is this thing that God has given to us as a gift. It's something that as we grieve, as we work through things, as we experience these hurts and this heartache, that at some point we'll come to the point where we can say, I can let it go. I can forgive whoever was responsible for that. Maybe we thought it was us. Maybe it was somebody else. But as we go through that, we can work through it and say, okay, I'm ready to let go with this now. I've worked through this enough. And I think that we'll probably talk more about this next week, but sometimes there are losses that we can't fully heal from. And it's not that we haven't gone through the grieving process enough, but that's a hole that's just never going to quite be filled again. And we'll talk about that more next week. But for now, we want to try to work through grief. We want to try to go through it and not to hide it. And so I think sometimes, let's go back to what I was talking about. Okay, our car broke down, or lost a job, or whatever it might be. Right? I was really excited, and I was expecting this person to be my really good friend, and I thought we were on the right track, and then suddenly Like, they're just not my friend anymore. I don't know what happened, right? Like that's a disappointment. That I wanted this situation to work out differently, and we need to grieve those things. So I'll give you a personal example. A few months ago, so some of you guys know that I was looking for a job. I've been looking for a job for a while, and I found this one that was amazing, and it was like the job was tailor-made for me. I was really excited for it. I went down for the first interview. I was a bit nervous going into it, and because I'd heard that they've been looking for somebody for a long time, and they turn away most of their candidates in this first interview, and so I showed up, and it went amazing. It was supposed to be an hour interview. It went almost 2 hours, and we were having a great time, and the recruiter got back and said, "Oh man, they loved you. This is great." I was like, "All right, yeah, this is perfect. I love them," right? And so then they say, "Okay, that was the behavioral interview. Now you're going to come for a technical interview." And I go in, and I was pretty nervous about the technical interview, and I tell myself as I'm going to calm my nerves. I was like, "This is my first day at my new job, and I'm going to go meet my new coworkers," and it worked. And I got in there, and I basically nailed it. I made a couple of mistakes, but in general, it went really well. It went so well that the guy, the lead interrogator, the lead interviewer, who I'd been with in the previous session, started to say, "Well, we've got to talk to our HR guy, but I don't think there's any reason why we wouldn't. Well, we'll let you know." I was like, all right, this is good. I've got the job. Yes, this is perfect. And I didn't hear anything for a week and a half. And so I sent an email and nothing. And the recruiter sends an email and nothing. And 2 days later, I get an email that says, "Thank you for interviewing." And for me, this wasn't just another job. There was a lot more that was bundled up into this. And I was looking at this job as God's blessing in our life and Him providing for us, and finally like getting to do something that I've wanted to do for a long time, and just so many different things. And that loss was I don't want to use the word catastrophic because I feel like that's going to minimize other losses, but it was a really, really big deal to me. And so when I got that, I mean, it's still hard for me to talk about a little bit, but I can talk about it, and I'm not crying. So what I did was I just took it. I got the email. It's on my phone. I'm at work, and I just left. I hadn't taken my lunch yet. I just left. I got in my car. I drove away somewhere that I could be alone. I just cried. I cried and I cried and I yelled at God, and I was like, "Why would this happen? And I thought this and all these things." And I did this for about 30 minutes or so, or 45. Who's counting? But I did it. I just embraced this. Like, this is my loss. I'm super disappointed. This has cut me deeply because I thought God, I thought that this is what you were doing for us and for our family and for my life and all of these things, and it was going to be perfect. And I was grieving, and I grieved my loss. And I went home that night and cried a little bit to Judy, and I worked through it, right? And I wish I was working there. I'm not going to lie. It was a pretty cool place with great people doing some things that were fun and interesting, and there were a lot of good things about that job, but I'm not weighed down by it anymore, right? And it's important that when we experience these things, that we experience those losses, that we accept them, and that we work through them. This is probably the last thing I'm going to talk about this morning. I've been going for a while. One of the reasons why it's so important for us to be in the practice of processing our grief is because grief is a very important part of forgiveness. And there's lots of reasons. We've been talking about all these other reasons for grief, but grief is a really important part of forgiveness, whether we are asking for it or whether we're giving it. So when we're in the place of giving forgiveness, it's very important that we don't just gloss over what happened, that we don't just, I forgive you, we're done, okay, thank you, goodbye. Right? Don't just this quick pat, okay, we're done, I forgave, like, okay, whatever, we're done. Because there's no depth to that. Right? If somebody does something, maybe somebody breaks my window or something on accident, and they say, I'm really sorry about that. I'm like, you know what? It's okay. It's no big deal. It's just a window. We'll get it replaced, right? That's something that's easy to gloss over and be like, yeah, you know what? No big deal. In the grand scheme of life, what's $50 or $100 or whatever a window costs, right? But then other things, maybe we've been betrayed by a friend, or we've had something really, somebody hurt us in a deep way. It's fine. You just stabbed me in the back, and I thought you were my friend, and I thought all these things, but we're good. I forgive you. Don't worry about it. Right? Is there something wrong with that picture? Right? If we were watching somebody doing this, we'd be like, are you okay? Because it doesn't seem like you're really, no, it's fine. Okay. Right? Because we haven't really forgiven. Why haven't we forgiven? Because we are, maybe because we're too afraid to look the loss in the eye. Because it's too hurtful to think that this person that we trusted, that we confided in, that we thought we were close, has hurt me this deeply, that have been so wounded. So the first thing is we need to be able to grieve whatever that loss is, whatever the thing is against us. We need to grieve that and work through that before we can actually get to real forgiveness. When Yeshua was on the cross, this is Luke 29, he did something that was really unimaginable if we stop and think about it. And as I read this, I want us to think about a time when somebody did something to you and you didn't know if you could forgive them for it. They wounded you so badly, and I don't know if I can do this right now. I don't know if I can forgive. I don't know if I can work through it. In Luke 29:32, it says, 2 others who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And Yeshua said, it's okay. They just don't even know it. God just whatever. It's all right. No, he didn't say that. Yeshua said, Father, don't forget what they did to me. Look at them. Look at how badly they're wounding me. Look at what they're doing to me. Just don't forget. No, that's not right either. Yeshua said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they cast lots to divide his garments. And the people stood by, watching, but the rulers scoffed at him, saying, He saved others, let him save himself, if he's the Messiah of God, his chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. There was also an inscription over him, This is the King of the Jews. And this was after a night and a day of being humiliated, of being beaten, of being berated, being whipped with this cat of nine tails that was laced with barbs and broken glass. It was after they paraded him naked through the city. After beating him and humiliating him all night, they paraded him naked through the city carrying his own cross. And Yeshua sits there and says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Right? He wasn't giving this pat, quick, hey, we're cool, don't worry about it, kind of thing. But he felt this deeply. And he's looking at them as they're in the very act of killing him. And he says, God, forgive them. Forgive them. When it's been hard for me to forgive somebody who's hurt me very deeply, this is what I've come back to. I've said, I can't get away from this. That even though it feels like, and sometimes it felt like my life was ending because of this, they're actively killing Yeshua. They're actively doing this to him, and he says, God, forgive them. Forgive them. Forgive them. And the only way that we can get to the point of actually forgiving somebody is if we go through the grief of the hurt and the loss that we've experienced because of them, and then decide, I'm going to forgive you. All right. Let's go ahead and pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this gift that you've given us to help deal with the hurt and the heartache that is inevitable in life. Thank you for this option that you've given to us of grieving, of fully embracing and experiencing the loss that we've encountered in our life. And God, I thank you that it's through this grieving process that we can find healing, that we can find closure, that we can find restoration, that we can be made well and whole again. Father, I pray that if there's anybody here who, or listening to this, who needs to grieve, who has things that they need to work through, God, I pray that you would help them, help us to process, to grieve, to take the time to recognize that grieving is not an inconvenience, and to fully embrace this process that you've given to us. Father God, that you would work by your Holy Spirit to come in and to wrap your arms around us, to embrace us, Lord, to bind up our broken heart, to bind up our broken spirit. God, because it's during this time of grief and mourning that you will comfort us by your Spirit, that you'll bring people around us to help comfort us as well. God, I pray that you would also help us, Lord, if people have done things against us that we find hard to process, to work through, and to truly forgive. God, help us to grieve the pain, to grieve the loss, to grieve what's happened, and to work through that, to find your comfort through the difficulty, and to be able to come out the other side and to offer true and real forgiveness to those who've hurt us. Oh God, we bless your name this morning. We thank you for giving us the comfort that we need Lord, and for also equipping us to comfort those who need it around us. We pray that your Spirit would be with us as we go, that you'd make yourself known to us as we go. In Yeshua's precious name we pray. Amen. All right, let's go ahead and stand. So this morning, I'm going to give the benediction, and we're going to dismiss, and we have Oneg, and I encourage you to stay and join us. But I know this has been maybe a hard message to hear. This has been maybe brought up things that hurts and pain from the past. And if anybody here needs to talk to somebody, if anybody needs to pray or to have prayer, we're going to have the sanctuary open. I'm going to be available, and my wife, and we would be happy to pray with you and to talk with you, to help you in any way that we can. And we'll have the sanctuary for prayer. So we just ask that any other conversation would, just out of respect, would be had out of the sanctuary. All right. Thank you. All right. Yevarechecha Adonai vayishmerecha. Yair Adonai panav elecha vihuneka. Yisa Adonai panav elecha vayasem lecha. Shalom. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord cause his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. Now may the Lord lift up his countenance on you and give you peace. Hashem Yeshua Amen. Lord bless you, and you are dismissed.